It's the end of the 1st century. 60 years ago, a young Jewish rabbi called Jesus of Nazareth turned things upside down with the way he spoke, with the things he did, the way he lived, the actions he performed right at the heart of the city of Jerusalem in particular, and at the heart of the Roman Empire. The powers of the day, the Jewish authorities who went along with the Roman Empire, some of them, and the Roman Empire itself decided that he was too much trouble, and so he was put to death. And then 3 days later, his grave was empty and his followers reporting, sometimes in their hundreds, that he'd been raised from the dead. This movement grew of his followers who lived as if their God was a God of resurrection, a God who'd said a huge yes to everything that Jesus had said and did, and a God who was changing the world. Then 60 years pass, and this movement of Jesus followers is spreading but struggling. Some of them are feeling the movement is stuck. Because Jesus of Nazareth had talked about changing the world, but how much has changed? They're living under the heel of the Roman Empire, and their hopes, their values, their identity is being chipped away in 1,000 tiny ways each day. You're feeling tired. And all the time there's a pressure from the empire culture that surrounds you. It's tempting you. It's wearing you down in lots of tiny but persistent ways. And then a letter arrives. A letter that's to be read out when you guys meet together on a Sunday. It's from a Jewish follower of Jesus who you've heard of. He's called John, and he's actually been a hugely vocal critic of the Roman Empire. So much so that he's actually been imprisoned on an island called Patmos in an attempt to lock him down, to quarantine what he's trying to say. His crime, bizarrely, is atheism. He refuses to bow down and believe that the emperor is God the Lord, as he calls himself. It turns out, though, that being locked down on this island is limiting in lots of ways, but not in John's inspiration and his creativity. And so he writes, and he writes. And he writes his experiences down, and it turns out these experiences are for you to hear as you gather together where you are. As you hear the letter start to be read out loud, you hear a description of a really powerful experience John has of Jesus of Nazareth, but not the Jesus of Nazareth you've heard of, who is trapped 60 years in the past or stuck in a set of scrolls or a set of memories. This is someone who calls himself the living one, the Son of Man, and he has messages for you now. Your city is called Smyrna. Smyrna was in an ongoing rivalry with nearby Ephesus as to which was the primary city in Asia at the time. Coins were a great example of how you branded yourself, how you spread your propaganda, and Smyrna had gold coins minted with the inscription on them, "First in Asia," just in case anyone wanted to argue. Your city had been actually completely destroyed about 600 years ago, and then famously 300 years ago had been rebuilt, and now it was beautiful and elegant, a city that had died and that had come back to life, and now is full of temples to Rome itself and to each of its emperors since Tiberius, and now the Emperor Domitian himself. So John's letter describes an experience of Jesus of Nazareth, who describes himself as the risen one, the living one. He calls himself the first and the last. And as you listen, you'll be smiling inside your mind. You'll have lights flashing on in your memory banks, because in your Jewish story, the one who calls himself first and last is your God, the God of creation, the God who rescued you from slavery in Egypt, the God who created you to be a people to bring a blessing to the world. But not only that, your city is known as the first in Asia. And he describes himself as the one who died and came back to life in your city, died and came back to life. This is blowing your mind. And then Jesus says two words that are possibly, arguably, more meaningful than anything else in this message. In fact, over the weeks as we look at this letter called the Revelation, if there's only two words that you hear in that letter, these would be wonderful examples of that. Jesus says, I know. When I'm struggling, when I'm feeling under pressure that's too much, when I feel stuck, when I feel alone, sometimes those two words are the most meaningful. This Jesus says, I know. Jesus says, I understand. I'm not far away wondering how you're feeling. I'm not on the end of some cosmic telephone line thinking about you. I'm not on the end of a shaky video call. I'm here in the middle, in your midst. That's what this vision is of. I know what you are going through. You might feel stuck, but you're not alone. I'm right here with you, and I know. This is described in these scriptures as a God who moved into the area, who became flesh, who lived our lives, loved our loves with the highs and the lows and the joys and the sorrows, and who knows. Jesus goes on, he says, I know your afflictions. The word he uses means crushing pressures. He says, I know also your poverty. There's no profits in Smyrna in being a Jesus follower. You're poor despite the city being elegant and wealthy because you are locked out of the economic and the social system, sometimes by your own friends and neighbours. If you don't buy into the ideas of the empire and use the currency and get into the economic system, then you can't flourish. And so grinding poverty is the cross that these followers of Jesus have to bear in this place. Jesus, he says, I know there are other pressures. He talks about a specific group that he says are slandering. Slander is a word that it comes from the word blasphemion, which means to blaspheme, means to destroy, disrupt God's reputation. It seems that there's a group who call themselves Jews, and note carefully, this is not John or Jesus talking about the Jews in the area. This is a group of fake Jews, people who call themselves Jews and are obsessed maybe by Jewish ways and customs and trying to force them on other people. That makes this Jesus actually call them a synagogue of Satan. And before we go down the rabbit hole, Satan, the word Satan in Hebrew is the word for the accuser. This is not about somebody with a long red tail and horns. This is about the opposition, the resistance to what God is trying to do. Then Jesus says, potentially, maybe what the second most helpful words you could hear in this situation are. He says, do not be afraid. Do not be afraid of the suffering that is still to come. And for them and for any of the Jesus followers, suffering is still to come. It's not really what you want to hear. Sometimes I wish these set of stories would give me ways to avoid suffering and avoid hardship and avoid suffering, but it's not the truth of the scriptures. It's not the truth or the reality of life. Instead, through so many of these stories, through the songs of the Jewish songbook and collection of poetry we call the Psalms, those words echo out, God is our refuge and our strength and ever-present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear. This Jesus message mentions that some will end up in prison for 10 days. Why 10 days? Or remember, Jesus is revealing himself to John, who is inspired. He's an artist. He's soaked in his whole Jewish story. And numbers are given symbolic meanings in Jewish writings. 10 is a number that means completeness. Our fingers and toes are 10. There's the 10 commands. And 10 is used in that way. So it means here a long time, not necessarily 10 actual days. It's also a number of days, the same number of days that a young hero called Daniel in a book that Revelation mentions and alludes to time and time again to spark the imagination. Daniel's tested for 10 days, the young hero of the story, and he wins the challenge, by the way. 10 days may represent a long time, and suffering is real, but it's not an unlimited time, because there will be an 11th day. As you're huddling together, stuck, disheartened, and you hear these words read aloud, what I would be hearing is keep going. Keep going, even though death might be part of the suffering, because death is not the end of the story. Because of who this God is, because what he's done, and because of the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, what God is promising is not unlimited struggle, and is not death, but life. This God is in the business of life. Jesus talks about a reward for overcoming, for persevering, and a crown of life. And you might have jumped to the bit about a crown. I'm not actually sure I fancy wearing a crown, actually. I think it would be really uncomfortable. I hate Christmas parties when you have to wear those crazy hats for a while during the meal, and I can't wait to take it off. I would hate to have to wear a crown. How could I play football with a crown on? Jesus uses the word for a crown, which would again light people's imaginations up in Smyrna, because the word he uses is Stephanos, and the crown that Stephanos represented is not a gold crown, it's a wreath. It's a wreath that you got for finishing the race, and they were famous for their athletics and their games. It was a way the empire entertained people rather than have them think about what was happening around him. The crown that's being offered here is not the prize. The prize is life. And this Jesus isn't in the business of giving out badges. He's about giving life. And he himself has talked about life, not just any kind of life, but life in all its fullness. The kind of life that we were made for. You might call it eternal kind of life. Life in the world as it is going to be, if we hang on. Life in the world as it is put to rights, and life with God, the relationships restored after that 11th day. I hope that as you have listened this morning, your buttons have been pressed, your imagination's been sparked, your mind is now full of some questions. John and Jesus, God wants you to wake up, to be reminded, to be revealed again, to uncover as you struggle that this whole Jesus movement is not stuck at all. That things are moving forward, maybe in 1,000 tiny ways, and that God will finish what he started. We may be in the middle, in the meantime, and it may be hard, but we are never alone. Jesus says, I know. Do not be afraid. I am with you. There will be an 11th day. And our story is about life. Life in all its fullness. The life you were made for.